It's time to move on to the pattern stitches on the Corona Machine Adventure, and I have hit the first snag I cannot take care of on my own. So we'll bring Jack into this one. What should happen is that I choose a pattern repeat by using these dials, tell the needles whether to tuck or slip using this selector, and set the SAM button to A to indicate that I want automatic selection to take place. Pulling one or more needles back one position on the bed tells the machine which needles I want to be selected all the way across the bed. But I'm only having intermittent success. This first pass, I select and the machine does as I told it. It tucked every fourth stitch across. The next row, it didn't cooperate. It jammed. What you just saw is what has classically been happening to me, and it's the problem we're going to investigate. It basically is working. That needle tucked, that needle knitted, the fourth one tucked, 3 knitted, and so forth. That was the first pass. The second pass, it jammed. Now we're going to investigate why that occurred.
It looks as if this flipper doesn't go high enough. We'll go back and forth one time. See, now they're both down against the stops.
And are we in T or C now?
You asked me the hard question.
I
C.
did. Okay, that's slip.
All right, now when we go to T, what it looks like is, look, this one touches its corresponding piece and this one does not, but that's because this piece isn't sliding smoothly enough. See, I can get them both to come over and almost touch, but this one isn't sliding smoothly enough to come over far enough right there.
Would that cause a jam?
It could. See, watch. If I go this way, this one falls into place. This one goes over, but see, when I go back the other way, this one stays and this one slides, but it doesn't really slide over far enough to get to the flipper, so we may have to take the cover off, find out what's limiting this flipper, and put a little lubrication right in there. All right, we're tracing the path if the needle butt goes behind this selector and it raises this arm, but what we found is this piece on this side floats. It's not stationary. If it comes in this way, it lifts the arm because it hits this stop and then must lift the arm to come through. And this piece is absolutely rigid. So what we need to do is find out which one is right, the one that's loose and floats or the one that's rigid, and make them match.
And to be perfectly clear, this is the needle path taken when we are using the A setting and we have pushed back the selected needles.
Yes.
These 2 buttons unscrew. To get into the carriage, he found that 5 screws must be removed in the part that slides on the rear rail of the machine. This center screw needs to come out, and it's quite long, but the screw does not immediately release the dial. Turns out you have to rotate it all the way past 10, and then it'll pull off.
And see, the screw goes in here. So we'll have to set this once this is in place.
Jack thinks he has discovered how the machine knows whether you wanted a 4, 5, 6, or whatever number of stitches repeat.
Right.
We're looking now at what this dial affects on the underside of the carriage to cause, in this case, every group of 4 stitches to repeat the selection that you give it.
Right. And notice how this dial is actually working. You press down and it's walking this gear.
Okay.
So it's walking this gear tooth by tooth, and you can see the teeth clearly right here.
So our choices are every 4th through every 10th stitch.
Right. And you see this is continually walking until it comes out the other side. So this is a rack, and this dial is walking the rack back and forth. We're going to go back to 4.
So this should mean that we could select either 1 or 2 and 4 or stitch number 3 of the first 4, anything like that, and such a thing would be repeated all the way across the bed.
Yes. And notice from this side now, all right.
You're knitting sitting here.
Yeah, we're sitting here. Here's our handle. We're sitting right here. So the needle that we selected goes behind the selection lever. So now we're going to flip it over and show you what's going on when it does that. So now here's the needle butt coming in. The needle butt comes in, it hits that stop, and the stop is set by the movement of the rack back and forth. At 4, the stop is as close to the end of this lever as it can get. So this is where it's going to lift the lever just enough to let the needle butt pass through and follow its path around. Now, let's change the position of the rack under the dial, and let's go around to 8. And look at what we've got. Now look how far back this stop is. So the needle butt comes in, hits the stop. Look how high it has to lift the lever in order to get past it and go its way through the carriage. So lifting this is what's telling it to make that repeat.
The carriage is jamming much more frequently going one direction than the other direction, so we're looking for something that isn't the same from side to side.
It must be the same from side to side. Look at this flipper. It's in the extended position and there's no movement. This flipper, however, has too much bounce, and we're afraid that it's letting the needle butt get past it because it's not down far enough to meet this
to
plate.
Close the path.
When this plate comes over, that it's in the same line with that plate. I'm not happy with how much these are different in their looseness. This one over here doesn't seem to be as loose in its travel. And when I look, I see that there should be a congruent plane along this rolled edge and this triangle that supports that slide. This one looks slightly bent. It looks like it dips down as it comes across. I'm going to try and bend it back up just a little. This is a in transit or possibly dropped situation, but it'll let this move a little smoother.
This is going to be very hard for you to see on camera, but this triangle and this one should surely be the same, and they aren't quite. This one is flatter, and this one is a little bit depressed. It's towards the table, and Jack's going to explain why he thinks that's an issue and what he can do.
What we're seeing is, look at the distance. I'm going to slide it over. Look at the distance that there is between the support rail and that sliding triangle. And if we come over here to the other one, you can't get the screwdriver in. And I think that's because this is moved that direction, and I'm going to put the pliers on it and try to flex it back so that when this slides over, see again, you can get the whole screwdriver tip in there. It should be tight to this rail, just like this one is, and you can just move it a hair, but we're going to move this triangle here
up towards us a hair.
Up towards us, so that this sliding, this floater moves closer to this support rail in both sides. This is putting the rail back in its position, and this was the one that when it slid over, there was a huge gap.
You could practically throw an elephant through it.
Well, at least a small cat. And what I did was put it in the vise and grip this part and move the rail with my hand. So that was easy. And then I repeened this area. See, this is a peened rivet that holds those in place. And so to reduce the distance that this had along the shank of the rivet, I put this on the top of the vise where my finger is, and then hit it with the hammer right there to swedge that a little bit more and shorten the distance that it can travel. So let's put it back in and see how we did. We've made several adjustments, but when this slider comes over, it touches the tip of the flipper. You can see that. It goes over, it touches. This one does not. And I don't like the fact that this flipper is loose on here. See, if it came all the way over, it would touch. Because I'm not happy with that. And
Okay,
then we'll address.
But right now, all I can see is the back of your hand.
Okay.
Go ahead.
All right, what we were concerned about is this flipper being rigid, no flexing up and down. And this one was, see, it's still got a little bit of flex to it. And the way we're getting that out is coming over here to the post that it sits on, and we're tightening this bottom nut just a little bit at a time. We loosen the top nut to free the bottom one, then we're moving it just a bit at a time, tightening it up, and hopefully it'll pull that flipper tight to its post.
How would it have worked loose? Just an overtime thing?
Yeah. In transit, passage of time. All right, I'm actually faking it. I have my ignition wrench set in standard American, so I have 15/64 and 9/32 is what I'm using here to make up for not having the right metric set. Wonder how that happened. The point being that none of these are torqued down to such a degree that you can't use any open wrench that'll get on.
And what is that that's fitting it?
That is a 9/32 on the top nut and a 5/16 on the bottom nut. All right, here's what we've got. This little leg right here is the stop for this flipper in its movement, and this is held flat when the stitch dial is in. See, when it's not in place, this will move around. So I'm going to hold it down, then I'm going to try to flex this just a little bit this way to let this flipper travel just a little bit more. All dials are more alike than different, and you see the slant of that, the little wedge of this spring has to go into this declivity so that when you rotate, it'll start clicking in its grooves here. And this is actually the slider for the dial, and it has to go into this groove. It can either go in on this end or this end. We're going to shoot for that end, but so we're going to put this on like this. And then we have to, if the camera can see, we're going to have to flex this out of the way, the spring, to get the dial into it.
Sounds like you got it.
Well, no, it's not seated yet. Let's get around to our declivity.
That is one of the problems, is that it can seem convincingly like it's on there right and not be.
Yes.
And it sounded good to me, but he can feel it.
Right. It's not down yet.
And you won't.
Now you see what we got.
But we've run into that. It's pretty common for people to get in touch and say they had it apart and it's together again right, and now the stitch dial is not working, even though it goes around, and that's why in many cases.
Right. Now this particular dial, the dial itself is on, and you see I've got it set on 5, and it's held on by a long screw through the back, this, but the screw, see if I can do this slowly enough, the screw goes into the dial head. So supposedly when the screw is tightened down, we're going to be on that 5 right there. So here's how we do it. We get back here, we very carefully start the screw in, making sure we're not cross-threading, because this is a brass screw into a brass thread, and you can warp them very easily. So I'm using my little teeny flat point.
So you won't accidentally use too much leverage and strip it.
Can't over torque it. Now, when it starts to tighten up, right in that position, I can feel the dial moving in my fingers. So here's what we're going to do. We get around to the 5. That's where we need to be. I get in the back. I tighten up the screw. We're still on the 5. Oh, look, we're right on the money. We'll go around to 0. And see, we're a little off.
Just a hair off.
So we'll come back around to 10. 10 is right on the money. But let's go to 0 and set it on 0 so we know we're absolutely right. We loosen it just enough to let it move, put it right on the 0. And what I'm doing is I'm using my fingers to hold this clear part against the edge of the dial.
It's really a nice dial.
It is, and it's very sturdy compared to some others. Now we're on the 10, 1 dot, 2 dots, 9.
Yeah, it should be 3 clicks per number. And voila, pattern knitting is now working beautifully.